Summer 1212. A 12-year-old French shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes claims he's had a vision of Jesus Christ. Jesus gave him a letter, he says, instructing him to lead a crusade to Jerusalem. Not an army of knights. Not trained soldiers. Children. Tens of thousands of them. They'll march unarmed to the Holy Land, and when they reach the Mediterranean Sea, God will part the waters just like he did for Moses. They'll walk to Jerusalem, convert the Muslims through faith alone, and reclaim the city without shedding a single drop of blood. It sounds insane. It was insane. But by June 1212, 30,000 people, most of them under 20 years old, had joined Stephen's march. They never made it to Jerusalem. Most never made it home. Some drowned at sea. Others were sold into slavery. The rest died of starvation, disease, or exhaustion along the way. This is the Children's Crusade of 1212, and it's one of the most tragic disasters in medieval history. To understand how this happened, you need to understand Europe in 1212. For over 100 years, Christian Europe had been launching crusades to the Holy Land, trying to take Jerusalem back from Muslim control. The First Crusade in 1096 had succeeded, briefly. But by 1212, every major crusade since then had failed. The Third Crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart and other kings, failed to retake Jerusalem in 1192. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 didn't even make it to the Holy Land. Instead, the Crusaders sacked Constantinople, a Christian city, in one of the most shameful episodes in crusading history. The people of Europe were frustrated. They'd paid taxes to fund these crusades. They'd sent their sons and husbands to die in foreign lands. And Jerusalem was still in Muslim hands. At the same time, the Catholic Church was preaching crusades closer to home. In southern France, the Albigensian Crusade was being waged against the Cathars, a Christian sect the Church declared heretical. In Spain, Muslim forces from North Africa had recently invaded, threatening Christian kingdoms. The Church was calling for fighters everywhere. Sermons about crusading filled the streets. Processions marched through towns, carrying crosses and relics. The atmosphere was charged with religious fervor and apocalyptic dread. People believed the end of the world was near. Comets, floods, and famines were interpreted as signs of God's anger. In this environment, it's not hard to see how a charismatic boy with a compelling vision could gather a following. Stephen of Cloyes was that boy. According to the chronicles, he was a shepherd from a village near Chartres in northern France. In the spring of 1212, he began preaching in the streets, claiming Jesus had appeared to him and given him a divine mission. He said God would perform a miracle for the children. Adults had failed to take Jerusalem because they were sinful and corrupted by greed. But children were innocent. God would favor them. Stephen's message spread like wildfire. Teenagers left their families. Young adults abandoned their farms. Even some priests joined the movement. By early June, thousands had gathered at the Abbey of Saint Denis near Paris. Stephen demanded an audience with King Philip II of France. Remarkably, he got it. The 12-year-old shepherd stood before the king and asked for permission to lead a crusade. Philip refused. He told Stephen to go home. But Stephen ignored him. With or without royal approval, the march would continue. By late June 1212, contemporary sources estimate that Stephen's following had swelled to around 30,000 people. Modern historians think the number was probably closer to 15,000 to 20,000, but even at the lower estimate, that's an enormous crowd. And the vast majority were young. Some were literal children, as young as 6 or 7. Others were teenagers or young adults in their early 20s. The medieval term used to describe them was pueri, which can mean children, boys, or even poor peasants depending on context. Whatever their exact ages, they were young, inexperienced, and unprepared for what lay ahead. The march south began in earnest. They traveled on foot, hundreds of miles from northern France toward the Mediterranean coast. They had no supplies. No organized leadership beyond Stephen. No plan for what they'd do when they reached the sea. They survived by begging for food and sleeping in fields or barns. Many grew sick. Some turned back. But thousands pressed on, driven by faith and the belief that God would provide. By the time they reached Marseille on the southern coast, their numbers had dwindled, but thousands still remained. When they arrived at the harbor, Stephen declared that the sea would part. The crowd gathered on the beach and waited. And waited. Nothing happened. The Mediterranean didn't split. No divine path appeared. Days passed. The mood shifted from hope to confusion to despair. They were stuck. They had no money to pay for ships. They had no way to cross the sea. And many were too weak or too far from home to turn back now. That's when 2 local merchants appeared. Their names, according to later chronicles, were Hugh the Iron and William the Pig, though some historians think these were nicknames added later to vilify them. The merchants made an offer. They would provide ships free of charge to transport the children across the Mediterranean to the Holy Land. It seemed like an answer to their prayers. God had provided a way after all. Thousands of the young crusaders boarded 7 ships. They set sail, believing they were finally on their way to Jerusalem. They never made it. According to a 13th-century chronicle written by a monk named Alberic of Trois-Fontaines, 2 of the ships sank in a storm off the coast of Sardinia. Everyone on board drowned. The other 5 ships didn't head to the Holy Land at all. They sailed to North Africa, to ports controlled by Muslim rulers in what are now Tunisia and Algeria. The children were sold into slavery. Hugh and William had never intended to take them to Jerusalem. They were slave traders. They'd lured the children onto ships with promises of free passage, then sold them to North African markets where young European slaves fetched high prices. Some versions of the story claim that a few of the children were taken to Egypt, where they were sold to the Sultan. A handful supposedly ended up as household servants or laborers. Others were never heard from again. The monk Alberic, writing decades after the event, claimed that the bodies of the drowned children washed ashore on the island of San Pietro near Sardinia, where they were buried and became the site of pilgrimages. He said Pope Gregory IX later ordered a church built there called the Church of the New Innocents. Modern historians are skeptical. There's no evidence the church was ever built. The story of the shipwreck and the slavery may be partially true, or it may be exaggerated. The sources are maddeningly inconsistent. But what's certain is that the children who boarded those ships never came home. Meanwhile, a second children's crusade was happening in Germany. Around the same time Stephen was preaching in France, a boy named Nicholas emerged in Cologne. Like Stephen, Nicholas claimed to have had a divine vision. He said an angel told him to lead a crusade. Nicholas promised his followers that when they reached the Mediterranean, the sea would dry up and they could walk to Jerusalem. He gathered around 20,000 followers, maybe more. They marched south through the Alps toward Italy. The journey was brutal. The Alps in 1212 were not easy to cross, even for experienced travelers. For poorly clothed, malnourished children and teenagers, it was a death march. Many froze to death in the mountain passes. Others collapsed from exhaustion or starvation. Bodies were left along the trail. By the time Nicholas's group reached Italy, their numbers had been cut in half. Those who survived pressed on to Genoa, a major port city on the Italian coast. When they arrived, Nicholas led them to the harbor and declared that God would part the sea. Just like in Marseille, nothing happened. The sea remained stubbornly unparted. The people of Genoa, who had initially welcomed the young crusaders with curiosity, grew annoyed. The city didn't want thousands of homeless, starving children camping in the streets. The city council told them to leave. Some did. Others begged to stay, hoping for a miracle or a ship. A few managed to find work as laborers or servants in Genoa and remained there for the rest of their lives. Nicholas refused to give up. He led a smaller group west to the port of Pisa, where he hoped to find ships willing to take them to the Holy Land. Again, they were turned away. Desperate, Nicholas decided to travel to Rome to seek the Pope's blessing. If the Pope sanctioned their crusade, maybe ships would come, maybe money would appear, maybe the miracle would happen. Nicholas and his remaining followers walked to Rome and gained an audience with Pope Innocent III. The Pope listened to Nicholas's story. Then he told the boy the hard truth. The crusade was over. Nicholas and his followers were too young. They should go home, the Pope said, and when they were older, they could join a real crusade. Some chroniclers claim the Pope added, "These children put us to shame. While they rush to recover the Holy Land, we sleep." Whether he actually said that or whether it was added later to make the story more dramatic, we don't know. What we do know is that Nicholas's crusade ended in Rome. The survivors tried to return home. Many didn't make it. The journey back through the Alps was just as deadly as the journey south. More froze. More starved. Those who made it back to Germany found that their families had given them up for dead. Some were welcomed home. Others were not. Nicholas himself vanished from the historical record. No one knows what happened to him. He may have died on the journey. He may have lived quietly somewhere, too ashamed to return to Cologne. We simply don't know. So what actually happened in 1212? The sources are a mess. Medieval chroniclers writing decades after the event mixed fact with legend, exaggeration with religious moralizing. For centuries, the Children's Crusade was presented as a romantic tragedy, innocent children led astray by false prophets or sold into slavery by evil merchants. But modern historians have questioned almost every detail. Were the participants really children? Or were they mostly poor, landless peasants and teenagers, dismissed as pueri not because of their age but because of their social class? The most comprehensive study of the Children's Crusade was done by historian Peter Reeds in 1977. Reeds examined over 50 contemporary sources and concluded that while the movement did happen, much of what we think we know about it is based on unreliable later chronicles. He argued that the term pueri likely referred to social class as much as age. The movement wasn't an army of 6-year-olds. It was a mix of teenagers, young adults, and poor peasants, with some actual children among them. The sources that mention children specifically are the least reliable. The more credible sources talk about young people, not toddlers. But even if we accept that many participants were teenagers or young adults, that doesn't make the story less tragic. These were still vulnerable, desperate people, driven by religious fervor and false promises, who died by the thousands. Whether they were 8 years old or 18 doesn't change the fact that they were manipulated, abandoned, and in many cases, killed. The Children's Crusade happened because the people of medieval Europe believed deeply in the power of faith and miracles. They believed God could part seas and deliver victories without armies. And when charismatic leaders like Stephen and Nicholas told them God had chosen them for a divine mission, they believed that too. The failure of the Children's Crusade did not stop crusading. In 1218, just 6 years later, the Fifth Crusade was launched, this time with papal approval and proper military leadership. It also failed. Crusading continued for another 2 centuries, but Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. The Children's Crusade became a footnote, a strange and tragic episode that illustrated the darker side of medieval religious enthusiasm. Today, historians still debate what really happened in 1212. The story has been told and retold so many times that separating fact from fiction is nearly impossible. But the core truth remains. Thousands of young people, driven by faith and desperation, left their homes to march to a land they had never seen. They believed God would protect them. They believed miracles would save them. Instead, they found death, slavery, and betrayal. The Children's Crusade stands as a reminder of what happens when religious fervor, poverty, and false promises collide. It's a story of manipulation and tragedy, of how easily hope can turn into disaster, and how the innocent often pay the price for the failures of those in power.